The truck rolled in slow gravel, crunching beneath its tires like the land already belonged to them. "Beautiful land out here. Real quiet, real private," Deke Rawlins said, eyes sweeping the fields. Angela Vale didn't flinch. "It's not for sale." 2 days later, they came back. Kendricks was gone. Angela was taken, left a threat nailed to the door. They didn't know he was a former Navy SEAL. They didn't know what they'd started. They unknowingly unleashed a force that would dismantle their gang, piece by piece. And when it was over, there'd be no headlines, only silence and consequences. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun was sinking low, casting a deep golden hue over the rows of vegetables and fruit trees that stretched out from the Vale property like a living tapestry. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth and tomato vines, rustling through the crops in lazy waves, as though the land itself were breathing. Angela Vale stood at the edge of the field, her sleeves rolled up and streaked with soil, arms straining as she hoisted another crate of produce onto the wooden flatbed hitched to the ATV. The fading warmth of the day settled on her skin, and despite the work, she allowed herself a brief moment to pause and admire what she and her husband had built with their own hands. A short distance away, Kendricks moved with deliberate focus, inspecting the irrigation line that curved along the eastern boundary of their property. He knelt by the junction valve, fingers tightening the metal with the kind of care that came from years of precision. Not the kind you learned on a farm, but the kind you never forgot from another life. Though his face was calm, there was something measured in every movement, as if he were always listening to something others couldn't hear. He didn't glance up often, but when he did, it was with the trained sweep of a man who still mapped exits out of habit. Inside the house earlier that morning, Angela had found another envelope tucked under the front door. The seal was clean, but the name on the letterhead was familiar. Another offer from a real estate group that had been circling them like vultures for months. She had tossed it onto the table with a sharp sigh. Kendricks didn't say much, just opened the drawer beneath the window and quietly slid the envelope in beside the others. Each offer was more aggressive than the last, and each one had ended up right there, filed next to a business card that read, "Harlan Realty Group, moving the South forward." Angela didn't like how quickly things were shifting in town. She'd grown up here, seen farmland paved over, neighbors pushed out, families pressured into selling what their grandparents had died owning. Lately, the calls had grown more frequent, the letters more insistent. Kendricks said very little, but Angela knew him well enough to see the tension in the way his jaw set whenever her voice carried that edge of worry. He didn't scare easily, but that didn't mean he wasn't preparing. As the last shadows of day stretched long across the field, a sound interrupted the quiet rhythm of their evening. Gravel crunched beneath tires, and both Angela and Kendricks turned to see a pickup truck rolling down their long dirt path, stirring up dust that hung in the air like smoke. The vehicle came to a slow stop just outside the fence line, its body battered and sun-faded, the kind of truck that had seen a lifetime of bad miles. From the cab stepped 3 men, all white, all dressed in the sort of casual grime that suggested they weren't here for a social call. Deke Rawlins led the group, a thin, leathery man in his late 40s with mirrored sunglasses and a long stride that spoke of entitlement. Behind him came Cole Jenkins, broader and younger, chewing on a toothpick and scanning the property like he already owned it. The third man hung back, Kevin Motley, young, pale, and visibly uncertain, his eyes shifting between the others like he wasn't sure why he was even there. Deke offered a slow, exaggerated wave as he approached the fence, the kind of gesture meant to disarm, but not quite sincere. "Evenin'," he called out, voice as casual as spilled beer. Kendrick straightened from the irrigation line, wiping his hands on a cloth without urgency. "Y'all looking for someone?" he asked, keeping his tone polite but flat. Deke smiled. "Nah, just heard some things about this place. Word is, it's on the market. Figured we'd come see for ourselves. Beautiful land out here. Real quiet, real private." Angela moved to Kendricks's side, folding her arms across her chest. "It's not for sale," she said plainly. Deke raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. "That so? Huh? Must be a misunderstanding." Fellas down at the county office said something different. Sounded like there's already paperwork in motion. A development agreement, maybe. One of them handshake deals the city likes to push through when they know what's best for the area. "It's not for sale," Kendricks repeated, voice steady and lower now. Cole spat on the ground near the truck, leaning against the hood like he had nowhere else to be. "Maybe you ain't heard, but this land's already spoken for," he said, glancing at Angela like she was part of the property in question. "Best thing y'all could do is take that check and move on back to wherever." Kendrick stepped forward then, not fast, not loud, but in a way that made the space between them feel suddenly smaller. His eyes locked onto Cole's, with a focus that drained the blood right out of the younger man's face. There was no threat in his words, no raised voice, only a presence, quiet and heavy, like a storm building pressure behind silence. Deke raised a hand to break the tension. "We ain't looking for trouble, just making offers. Some folks take 'em, some don't. But everyone's got a price. That's just the world we live in." Kendricks didn't move. "Then go look for someone else." Angela's voice cut in sharp and clear. "You came up our road uninvited. You leave the same way." Deke's smile thinned. Shame to see good land go to waste. Out here, things tend to happen when folks hold out too long. Fires. Accidents. Real shame. Kendricks took another step forward. "This is the last time you'll be standing here talking." Cole opened his mouth. Something nasty loaded on his tongue, but Deke slapped the side of the truck. "That's enough," he said firmly, motioning them back. "We'll be seeing you." The truck kicked up dust as it reversed and turned, the cloud hanging long in the orange light. Kendricks didn't watch them go. He turned to check the fence instead, fingers brushing along the wiring, slow and deliberate. Angela stayed beside him, arms still crossed, eyes locked on the horizon. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew the same thing. They weren't done. Not even close. 2 days after the unwanted visit, the morning began like most others on the farm. Quiet, industrious, and full of the kind of peace that only people who had known violence could truly appreciate. Kendricks had left early, well before sunrise, with the truck bed loaded and strapped down. The local co-op expected the weekly delivery before 9, and he preferred to make the drive while the roads were still empty. Angela watched him pull away from the porch, his figure outlined by the fading red glow of the taillights as they disappeared down the gravel path. She had insisted on staying back this time, citing the long list of chores that had stacked up: repairs to the greenhouse panels, fresh hay to lay down in the barn, and the crates of potatoes still waiting to be sorted and stored before the next rain. Kendricks had nodded. No argument. She was more than capable, and neither of them had expected trouble to return so soon. By mid-morning, the sun had begun to climb past the tree line, its heat simmering off the metal roof of the shed where Angela now worked, arms deep in the day's labor. A wheelbarrow rested half-filled with feed sacks and spare tools, while the hum of cicadas underscored the silence that blanketed the land. She had just finished restacking a row of seed trays when a faint shimmer caught her eye from across the field. Something just beyond the tree line, where the rows of corn dipped into a thicket. A subtle flicker. A reflection of glass, maybe. She blinked, shook the sweat from her brow, and thought little of it, until a second glint came, too steady to be accidental. Cole Jenkins sat beneath the cover of low brush, his elbows resting on a raised knee, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The lenses adjusted smoothly as he tracked her movements across the property. From his position, the house was half obscured by a rusted trailer and tool shed, but he could see enough. One hand stayed on the phone in his lap, thumb moving lazily across the screen as he sent updates to Deke. She's alone. Been outside for over an hour. Still no sign of the husband. Moving now. By the time Angela wheeled the barrow around to the west gate, the truck had already begun its slow approach. She didn't hear it at first over the buzz of insects and the low rumble of her own effort. But when the tires hit the gravel, crunching in a steady rhythm, she paused, straightened, and wiped her palms on the front of her jeans. Same truck. Same dull, rust-bitten body. Same plume of dust rising behind them as they rolled to a stop. This time, not even bothering to stay by the fence. The tires settled close enough to the barn door that Angela felt her throat tighten. The driver's side door opened, and Kevin climbed out first, flashing what he probably thought was a harmless smile. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, holding up one hand like a peace offering. "Didn't mean to scare you. Just figured we'd try again. You know, be neighborly." Angela didn't move. "He's not here," she said, watching their eyes for the smallest twitch. Cole stepped around from the passenger side. "We ain't looking for him." Angela kept her voice firm. "I told y'all before. This land's not for sale. Don't need visitors." Kevin looked sheepish. He nodded slowly, glanced back at the truck. "Yeah, I understand. Just, it's hot out here. Could I maybe get a little water before we head out?" Angela hesitated. It was a simple request, harmless on the surface, but something in her gut shifted, an unease that crept like a cold shadow down her spine. She turned to gesture toward the pump by the barn. "It's right over there. Help yourself." As she started to turn back toward the barrow, her gaze caught a sudden blur of movement in her peripheral vision. Another door slammed shut. Cole was already moving. So was Deke. They had waited in the truck bed, crouched low and hidden behind a tarp, just out of sight. She spun just as Deke crossed the distance with a practiced stride, one hand raised not in peace, but in command. "Don't fight it," he warned. "Won't help you." Angela took a half-step back, eyes wide, body twisting toward the open field. But she never got the chance to run. Cole grabbed her arm hard, yanking her off balance. She kicked, catching him square in the shin, and let out a scream that tore into the still air like a blade. Kevin flinched, half lunging forward to help, then hesitating as Angela's elbow slammed into Cole's stomach. She wasn't small, and she wasn't passive. Her nails found skin, her knee struck bone, but it wasn't enough. Deke caught her hair from behind, wrenched her back, and with the force of 3 men, they wrestled her into the open rear door of the truck. Her legs kicked the frame, her voice carried across the field. A boot scraped her ribs as they forced her in. The door slammed shut, sealing the noise away in an instant. By the time the dust had settled and the taillights disappeared beyond the gate, the yard was silent again. One overturned crate lay on its side, tomatoes crushed and leaking into the dirt, the only witness to what had just been stolen. Kendricks wouldn't return for another 40 minutes. When he did, the truck was gone. The yard was too quiet, and Angela was no longer there. The gravel shifted under the tires as Kendricks pulled into the driveway, the truck's engine settling into a low idle as he rolled to a stop beside the barn. The sun had begun to lean west, casting long shadows across the yard and gilding the rooftop in soft copper light. He tapped the dashboard once, then cut the engine, letting the silence reclaim the air around him. For a moment, it felt like any other day. But something was off. He noticed it in the stillness. Normally, by the time he returned, Angela would be on the porch, barefoot, maybe sipping something cold while waiting for him to unload. She'd tease him for forgetting to bring back her list of hardware store odds and ends, then insist on helping anyway. But today, there was no movement, no sound of the screen door swinging open, no figure waving from the top step. The porch was empty. He climbed down from the truck and walked toward the house, his boots crunching across the gravel. As he neared the steps, he glanced toward the crates stacked beside the shed. One of them had tipped, contents scattered haphazardly across the ground. A rake lay on its side nearby, the handle cracked as if it had been dropped too quickly. The wheelbarrow was tilted in the dirt, halfway loaded, abandoned mid-task. His pace slowed. Angela never left a job half done. At the porch, he reached for the door and paused. There, nestled between two boards near the top step, was her phone. The screen was dark but intact, resting just slightly off the welcome mat, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. Kendricks crouched down slowly, picked it up, and turned it over in his hand. No cracks, no obvious damage, but it was unlocked, open to the camera app, as if she'd been trying to record something or take a picture when it slipped from her fingers. He stood up carefully, scanning the horizon, the tree line, the barn. His heart was not racing. Not yet. But something inside him, the part that always listened, always watched, had started counting details. Silence. Tools dropped mid-task. Her phone on the porch. No note left on the counter. No sound from the house. He opened the door. Inside, the air was cool and still. The kitchen was just as he'd left it that morning. Coffee pot still half full. 2 mugs in the sink. A dish towel slung over the chair. But the back door, the one near the greenhouse exit, stood slightly ajar, letting in a faint draft. Then he saw it. Taped to the wood near the handle, written in permanent marker on the back of an old envelope, were the words, "Sell, or she dies." He stared at the message for several seconds. His mind didn't panic. It narrowed, tightened. He stepped back from the door, closed it gently, and locked it. Then he walked to the pantry. With one hand, he moved aside a shelf of canned tomatoes and pulled open the narrow wood panel hidden behind it. The hinges creaked softly, revealing a recessed compartment that didn't belong in a farmhouse. Inside, sealed in vacuum-tight plastic and metal cases, was another life. He pulled out the largest container first, placing it on the table. Then came a smaller one, flatter, with a thick rubber seal. Finally, he lifted a hard-shell case from the very back and snapped the latches open. The contents were arranged with ruthless precision. A compact, collapsible assault rifle fitted with a suppressor. A black sat phone wrapped in cloth. Encrypted drives labeled only with codes. 2 maps, one of the county, the other of a broader radius, marked in red circles, and a laminated ID badge so worn it had begun to curl at the edges. K. Vale, Tier 1 Recon Unit, disavowed. He stared at the photo for a long moment. He had been younger then, leaner in the face, eyes colder. The kind of cold that didn't come from weather. Kendricks laid the gear out across the kitchen table, moving with slow, measured intention. Gloves, optics, comms, GPS, a weather-sealed medpack, half-used but still viable. His sidearm, freshly cleaned, loaded with subsonic rounds. He did not speak, not until he reached into the smaller case and pulled out a worn leather wallet that held a single photograph. It was a print, old school, creased at the corners. Angela stood in the garden, grinning at him, arms muddy from replanting after a spring storm. She had hated that picture. He had kept it anyway. He held it in both hands, inhaled once through his nose, and exhaled slowly. "I'm coming," he said. Not a promise. A fact. He folded the photo carefully, tucked it into the inside breast pocket of his vest, and began the mental checklist. Routes, intel, timing, surveillance, weak points. The soldier was awake now, and he would not sleep again until she was home. Night draped itself over the countryside like a veil of smoke, the last blush of twilight swallowed by clouds rolling in low and heavy. The air was damp with the smell of rain and dust, a tension hanging in the sky as though even the weather sensed something violent brewing beneath the surface. Kendricks drove without headlights, his truck crawling along the edge of town like a predator skirting the edge of a herd. He had swapped the plates earlier that afternoon and covered the bed with a tarp. Nothing about his appearance matched the man who had delivered tomatoes that morning. His beard had been trimmed down to stubble, a ball cap shadowed his face, and the clothes he wore, muddy boots, tattered jacket, hands darkened with engine grease, fit the profile of someone you wouldn't notice. He parked 2 blocks off Main Street, away from the noise and light, and slipped through the back alleys with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked darker streets in worse parts of the world. Ahead, just off the main drag, sat a sagging bar whose neon sign buzzed and flickered like it had long given up trying to attract new customers. The Thirsty Mule had served the same people for decades, men who knew each other's fathers, who didn't like outsiders, and who never asked questions if blood showed up in the gravel outside. Kendricks found a shadowed corner across the street and waited, crouched beside a delivery truck with its rear doors half open. The back entrance to the bar faced him directly. Music bled out through the warped screen door, classic rock, distorted by years of cheap speakers and cheaper whiskey. He stayed still, watching as figures drifted in and out. Most came alone, a few in pairs. It wasn't until close to midnight that he saw what he had been waiting for. Cole stumbled out first, one hand on the doorframe as he cursed and barked a laugh into the humid air. Kevin followed, looking more sober, but still dragging his feet, head down, eyes darting. They stood near the alley for a moment, sharing a cigarette, talking too loud about something they shouldn't have been. Kendricks watched their body language, catalogued the slurs and threats that spilled from their mouths. Cole laughed about how she kicked like a mule and mimed holding someone down. Kevin winced, barely laughed, and kept glancing behind him like he knew something was off. They started walking together toward the lot behind the bar, likely to cut through to the street where they'd parked. Kendricks waited until they passed, counted 4 steps, then moved. He crossed the alley in complete silence, every footfall placed with care. The gravel didn't betray him. The wind covered what little sound remained. As the pair rounded the corner of the bar into the tree-lined footpath that curved behind the building, Kendricks was already moving to intercept. They were laughing again, Cole waving his arms, mimicking Deke's threats. Kevin hung back, dragging his heels, distracted by something on his phone. Neither saw him coming. Cole didn't see the shadow move until it was already inside his space. There was no warning, no dramatic flourish, just a hard, deliberate grip on the back of his jacket, followed by a sharp twist and the sound of bone-meeting bark as Kendricks drove him sideways into the trunk of a gnarled oak. The blow knocked the wind clean out of Cole's chest. He gasped, tried to turn, but Kendricks moved with controlled precision, not allowing room for reaction. "What the—" Kevin started, his voice breaking, but it was too late. Kendricks pivoted on his heel and sent the toe of his boot squarely into Kevin's midsection, folding him in half with a groan. Kevin dropped his phone, arms wrapping around his gut, and staggered back until he fell hard into the brush behind him. Cole managed to right himself, but just barely. He swore through gritted teeth and swung wildly, his fist arcing toward Kendricks's jaw, but the movement was sloppy, drunken, and desperate. Kendricks slipped the punch with ease, stepped in, and hammered an elbow straight into Cole's cheekbone. The crack of cartilage echoed through the trees. Cole collapsed to one knee, stunned, but still trying to fight through instinct. "You think this is a joke?" Kendricks said, his voice even, unhurried, but laced with fire. You think taking someone's wife makes you a man? Cole spit a mix of blood and saliva into the dirt and scrambled for something on his hip. His hand found the handle of a folding knife, thumb flicking it open with muscle memory more than thought. The blade gleamed faintly in the moonlight as he slashed upward in a wide arc. Kendricks stepped inside the strike, letting the blade whistle past his shoulder, and caught Cole's wrist with a crushing grip. With a sharp twist and a downward jerk, he disarmed him cleanly, then reversed the knife and buried the hilt into the soft meat of Cole's thigh. Not deep, just enough to drop him. Cole screamed, more in shock than pain, as his leg buckled. He crumpled again, this time staying down, writhing in the leaves. Kevin, to his credit, had regained his breath and managed to scramble to his feet. He looked between Kendricks and Cole, then turned to bolt toward the edge of the woods. But Kendricks moved fast, faster than either of them had expected. He reached out and grabbed the back of Kevin's hoodie, yanking him backwards off his feet. Kevin hit the ground hard, the air bursting from his lungs. "Stop! Please! I didn't touch her!" Kevin shouted, throwing his hands up. "I didn't want to do it! I told them not to!" Kendricks didn't answer. He grabbed Kevin by the collar and pulled him upright, driving him backward until his spine hit a tree. One hand pinned him in place while the other checked for weapons. He found nothing but a cheap folding blade in Kevin's boot and a lighter in his jeans pocket. "You followed orders," Kendricks growled. "You watched." "I didn't hurt her," Kevin choked, his voice rising. "Deke said we just needed leverage. I didn't know they were gonna—" "You didn't stop them." Kevin's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked like a child who had just realized his house was burning down with him inside. Behind them, Cole groaned and tried to rise again, dragging himself through the leaves with his good leg, his fingers reaching for the fallen knife. Kendricks turned his head slightly, read the motion in the periphery, then stepped away from Kevin just long enough to close the gap. He stomped down on Cole's wrist with a heavy, precise strike, shattering whatever hope the man had of continuing the fight. Cole screamed again, this time louder and messier, thrashing in the dirt like a fish pulled too far from water. "Shut up," Kendrick said, and drove his knee into Cole's ribs, once, then again. Controlled, exact strikes that broke resistance without wasting energy. Kevin curled inward against the tree, watching with wide, horrified eyes. His breath came in shallow gasps now, hands trembling. "I'll talk," he stammered. "I'll tell you. Please, just stop. I don't want to be part of this anymore." Kendricks turned back toward him, face unreadable. The kind of expression worn by someone who had stepped through too many doors and didn't expect to come out clean. For a moment, he simply looked at Kevin, measured him like a carpenter assessing a warped board. Then, without a word, Kendricks reached into his jacket and pulled out a length of braided cord, the same kind used in survival gear. He moved to the nearest tree and gestured with his head. "Sit." Kevin obeyed. Kendricks crouched in front of him and tied his hands behind the trunk, not so tight it would cut circulation, but snug enough to discourage second thoughts. Then he turned to Cole, who was now whimpering quietly, face pressed against the cold ground. "You'll talk too," Kendricks said, more to himself than to the man on the ground. "But you're not going to like how it starts." The night deepened around them, the air turning colder as the first drops of rain tapped the leaves like a distant warning. Kendricks remained silent as he finished tying off Cole's second wrist behind the trunk of a tree a few feet from Kevin. The once cocky enforcer had stopped trying to crawl. His body slumped against the bark, jaw clenched in pain. He was breathing through his nose in short, labored bursts, trying to hide the tremble in his limbs. The knife was still in his thigh, blood soaking into his jeans, a vivid bloom against the denim. Kendricks stood between them now, arms crossed, posture relaxed in that unsettling way that told both men he wasn't in a hurry. His eyes moved between Kevin and Cole as though he were reading a map, deciding which path to take first. The silence between them stretched long enough that Kevin finally broke it. "You got what you wanted," he said, his voice cracking. "We're not going to stop you. You can go. Just take the phone, man. We're done." Kendrick stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "You were there when they took her." Kevin swallowed hard. "Yeah, but I didn't touch her. I didn't help. I didn't know they were really going to do it." Deke said it was a bluff, just a scare tactic. Kendricks didn't respond with words. Instead, he walked over to Cole, crouched down beside him, and looked him directly in the eye. "Where did they take her?" Cole sneered through gritted teeth. "Why don't you go find out yourself?" The words hadn't fully left his mouth before Kendricks moved. He didn't yell, didn't posture. He just struck with a short, brutal punch that caught Cole in the side of the face, snapping his head back against the bark. The sound of cartilage giving way was dull and wet. Blood poured from Cole's nose as he gasped, coughing, trying to twist away despite his bound hands. Kendricks leaned in close. "That was the last time I asked nicely." Cole spat blood onto the dirt and grinned through it, his voice muffled. "You ain't gonna do nothing with us tied up like this. You're just mad. You're scared. Just a scared little husband trying to play soldier again." Kendricks didn't blink. He stood, reached behind him, and drew a blade. Not the same one from before, but a different one, flatter, blackened steel with a single notch near the handle. He turned it once in his hand, casually, then crouched behind Cole's injured leg and drove the hilt hard against the handle of the embedded knife. Cole howled, bucking against the tree, his face twisted in agony. His voice broke into a strangled sob. "Tell me where she is," Kendrick said, his voice lower now, almost calm. "Or I'll leave that knife in and start with the other leg." Kevin was hyperventilating beside them, shoulders twitching, hands trembling against the cord wrapped behind the tree. She was at the trailer," Kevin blurted. "Out near Old Creek Road. The hunting site. The busted one nobody uses anymore." Kendricks turned his head slowly, looking at Kevin with the stillness of a predator who had just been handed the scent he was after. "They moved her, though," Kevin added quickly. "Deke said it wasn't safe, said you'd come looking. I don't know where they took her now, I swear. They kept it quiet. Didn't tell me." Kendricks stepped toward him, eyes narrowing. "When did they move her?" "Yesterday morning. Real early. I didn't even know till later. Deke just said she was somewhere deep, off-grid. He didn't say where, but she's alive. She was alive then. That's all I know." Kendrick studied him, searching for cracks, for signs of deception. Kevin was crumbling, panic eating through his voice like acid. There was no bluff in it. He was out of lies and terrified of what Kendricks might do next. He turned back to Cole, who was groaning now, bleeding heavily but still conscious. Kendricks leaned in again, voice soft. 2 more seconds. "That's all you have to decide." Cole muttered something, barely audible, and Kendricks leaned closer. Then Cole turned his head and spit blood onto Kendricks's cheek. "Get lost." Kendricks didn't flinch. He wiped the spit off with the back of his hand, stood up, and without ceremony drove his knee once more into Cole's already fractured ribs. Cole screamed again, this time a higher, broken sound. Then Kendricks turned away, taking a deep breath, and walked several feet into the trees. He didn't look back. Behind him, both men were whimpering in the dark. Kevin was still repeating fragments. The trailer. Early morning. They didn't say where. Cole was coughing through blood and curses, his strength failing fast. Kendricks pulled Kevin's burner phone from his jacket, flipped through the screen, and tapped into the location history. A single red ping caught his eye. An old hunting site out past Route 9, deep in the woods, accessible only by back trails. It had been pinged just once in the last 24 hours. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He tucked the phone away, took one last look at the broken men slumped against the trees, and vanished back into the night, without a sound. The woods had changed with the elevation. Thicker, quieter, older. The soil turned soft beneath the tires of Kendricks's truck as he moved along a logging road that had long since vanished from GPS maps. Trees leaned in overhead like watchful sentinels, and the only light came from the low glow of his modified dash monitor. According to the burner phone's last transmission, the signal had spiked once, briefly, in this area before going dark. No return pings, no GPS echoes. Whatever was here, they didn't want it found easily. He pulled off the road 2 miles short of the marked location, covered the truck with a camouflaged tarp, and began the hike in. His gear was minimal: comms scanner, short-range binoculars, a sidearm holstered under his jacket, and a rolled set of paper maps he'd marked by hand the night before. Technology had its place, but nothing substituted for instinct and paper when someone was trying to hide in plain sight. As the incline rose and the trees thickened, the underbrush broke into a natural clearing where moss and fog settled like breath on glass. He slowed his steps, his eyes scanning the environment for anything out of rhythm. That's when he saw the faintest shimmer of smoke bleeding into the canopy. A thread-thin wisp almost invisible in the moonlight. He crouched behind a fallen trunk and raised the binoculars. There it was. Hidden among the pines, tucked back against a rocky outcropping that shadowed it from above, sat a hunting cabin. The windows were boarded over with fresh plywood, but he could see the faint tremble of a generator cable running from the rear to a buried power cell. No obvious antenna, no cell booster. A complete blackout location. It was smart. Kendricks pulled out his sketch pad and began drawing the terrain. Natural choke points, elevation shifts, sight lines from the ridgeline, wind direction. He took note of a narrow path that curved around to the back door, partially concealed by fallen brush and bramble. There would be guards, rotating, most likely. If Deke was behind this, he wouldn't make the mistake of keeping all eyes on the front. Kendricks knew Deke, knew his playbook, his patience. This wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about leverage, power, message, and Angela was the centerpiece. Inside the cabin, Angela sat against the far wall of a windowless back room, her wrists bound in steel cuffs looped through a radiator pipe. Her knees were drawn up close, arms resting on them, face partially hidden in the crook of her elbow. She wasn't broken. Not yet. But the weight of time pressed down on her like a thick blanket. There were no clocks in the room, no light except what filtered through a small slit beneath the warped door. Her sense of time came from footsteps. There were 3 of them. Deke's steps were slow, deliberate, with a measured rhythm and hard-soled boots that struck the floor like a metronome of control. Cole's were louder, uneven, always fast, always shifting direction. Kevin's steps were scattered, light, nervous, sometimes pacing in circles, sometimes lingering near her door longer than he should have. She had counted these things, memorized them, as though the rhythm itself might open a way out. She had also catalogued their voices, especially now, as they argued once again in the front room. "She's been in there too long," Cole snapped, the sound of his voice muffled but clear enough. "We should have moved already. She's not talking, and if he finds us—" "He won't find us," Deke interrupted, his tone cold, flat. "Not this deep. Not with what we've scrubbed." "You don't know him like I do," Cole said. "You didn't see his face when we pulled out. He's not going to call the cops. He's going to come for us." "Good," Deke replied. "Let him. Maybe then the deed lands in my lap with no more negotiating. You're so eager to wrap this up. You're forgetting the value of silence, Nobody's coming, nobody's looking, and nobody wants to explain why a bunch of white boys from a real estate firm ended up kidnapping a woman off her own land. There was a pause. Then Kevin's voice, softer, laced with hesitation. We should have never touched her. This ain't just leverage anymore. This is prison time. You don't think the sheriff's gonna ask questions if bodies start turning up in the woods? Sheriff won't find a body, Deke answered. If we need to disappear her, we will. But I'd rather the husband fold first. Makes it cleaner. Less noise. Angela sat perfectly still, breathing slow. The cuffs had rubbed her skin raw, but she'd already begun to twist them slightly, working a gap between the wrist bone and the edge. She had no illusion about her situation. She was isolated, chained, and outnumbered, but she wasn't helpless. Earlier, while they argued outside, she had shifted the mattress with her foot and spotted an old wooden splinter protruding from the bed frame. During their last argument, she'd pulled it free and hidden it in the seam of her pants. Now, when the footsteps passed less frequently, she worked at it behind her back, scraping it slowly along the edge of the radiator, sharpening the end to something more useful. It was not a weapon. Not yet. But it would be. From the ridge above the cabin, Kendricks raised his comms scanner and rotated through frequencies. Static. Silence. Then a flicker of digital chatter, a low-band radio signal bleeding through from inside. He caught fragments. Deke's voice, Kevin's nerves, a reference to shifting her again if he gets too close. He logged the frequencies, marked the strength, and stored the device. The wind was changing. The night would stretch long. But now Kendricks had a location, a layout, and the start of a plan. He didn't move quickly. This wasn't a rush. This was precision. And when the time came, he would strike where it hurt the most, with no warning and no chance to run. Angela was in that cabin, and he wasn't going home without her. The early hours of the morning bled slowly into the forest, painting the sky a deep steel gray before the sun had even dared show itself. The world was hushed, the birds not yet stirred, and even the wind through the trees seemed to hold its breath. Kendricks moved through the timberland like a shadow wearing skin, crouched low beneath the branches, hands busy with wire and steel. Just beyond the first ridge, where the only serviceable back road led toward the hunting cabin, he had begun laying the first of several traps. They were improvised, makeshift, yes, but no less effective for their simplicity. Strips of welded rebar, fitted with jagged points, were buried beneath a thin cover of needles and gravel. A careful arrangement of fallen logs stood poised near a blind curve, each one bound with paracord threaded through a tension-release rig he had built the night before. If a truck approached too fast, or with the wrong weight distribution, it would trip the line and scatter the debris across the road in a snare of chaos. Not enough to kill, just enough to isolate, delay, confuse. He finished the last tripwire just before first light crept through the clouds. He stood, brushing his gloves clean, then pulled a folded map from the inner pocket of his vest. The perimeter of the cabin was circled in red, with notes scrawled in pencil. Southeast entry, blind spot, generator, rear northeast, rotation, 1 guard, 15-minute loop. The notes were exact, timed from hours of patient observation and movement tracking. He didn't need digital confirmation to verify any of it. He trusted his eyes more than any device. But he also understood the advantage of leverage, especially the kind nobody expected him to have. Tucked against a crumbling utility shed 3 miles east of the cabin, Kendricks had uncovered the remains of an old service substation. Long dormant, the structure had once powered a stretch of private ranger posts during his time running post-military surveillance training in the area. He knew it like the back of his hand. knew its lines still led into the hills, forgotten but not dead. He popped open the rusted access panel, rewired the uplink, and connected it through a custom interface he'd kept buried for years. Within minutes, he had remote access to the patchy, offline-adjacent grid the cabin drew its generator through. What the gang didn't know, what no one would have guessed, was that someone had once run tactical exercises in this wilderness using every inch of the grid to simulate electronic warfare. He keyed in a command. The lights in the cabin wouldn't go dark now, not yet. But when they did, it would be at the exact moment he wanted them to, and the panic it caused would open the first door. Returning to his base camp beneath the overhang where he'd nested for the night, Kendricks knelt beside his gear and unrolled the canvas satchel that held his final preparations. One by one, he checked each item. Combat knife, clean and honed. Sidearm with a full clip of subsonic rounds. A flash grenade modified to emit more light than sound. Climbing gloves, night optics, a spare GPS tracker already pre-programmed to mark his fallback route. Then came the war paint. From a compact mirror and a worn tin of matte black cream, Kendricks began smearing the substance across his skin, under his eyes, across his brow, down the ridge of his nose, sharp, dark lines transforming his face from man to shadow. Each stroke was methodical, not ritual, not superstition, just readiness. He caught his own reflection briefly in the mirror. Then something in his face shifted. For a moment, a memory clawed its way to the surface. The heat of another forest, the feel of broken breath in his ear, the sound of a teammate's final gasp over comms before it went dead, his own voice shouting for air support that never came. A man left behind, blood in the trees, silence in the aftermath. His fingers paused mid-stroke, his jaw locked. Then he blinked, exhaled through his nose, and wiped the emotion away like fog on glass. Not today. Not this one. Kendricks reached into the inner flap of the satchel and pulled out the photo again. The one of Angela, dirt on her arms, her laugh frozen mid-motion, alive and full of fire. He looked at it with the same precision he gave to every other item in his arsenal. But when he spoke, it wasn't with cold calculation. "I'm almost there," he whispered. "Time's up." He folded the photo, slipped it into his vest pocket, and cinched the final strap on his gear. Miles away, the night still clung to the interior of the hunting cabin like a second skin. The generator buzzed faintly through the floorboards, its thrum a nervous heartbeat underfoot. Angela sat motionless, listening to it, trying to make sense of every sound. Her body ached from the constant pull of the cuffs, and the chain looped through the radiator had rubbed raw against her skin. But her mind remained unbroken. She had long since given up sleep. Sleep was a luxury for people who could trust the silence. There had been fewer arguments today. Deke was keeping quiet, brooding in the front room, while Kevin hadn't said more than a few words since sunset. He was unraveling, just as she'd hoped. She could hear the pacing, the nervous muttering. Cole was gone, his absence unexplained, but she could feel the tension rising in the air, like static before a storm. Angela tilted her head slightly, eyes closed, heart still. There was something different about the silence tonight. Not the absence of movement, but the feeling that something just beyond the cabin was beginning to shift. The kind of shift you can't hear, but feel in the marrow. And she knew. Somehow, without seeing, without knowing when, she felt it in her bones. Kendricks was close. Night fell thick over the cabin, draping the treetops in velvet darkness, and swallowing what little light remained beneath the clouds. The air was heavy with stillness, the kind that pressed against the lungs and dulled even the sound of footsteps on the forest floor. A chill had crept in with the wind, stirring the tall grass around the clearing and brushing the edges of the rooftop, with a sigh that went unnoticed inside. The men were uneasy. They didn't say it aloud, but it was written in the way they moved, the constant shifting of weight from one foot to the other, the glances exchanged without words, the unnatural silence between them. It had been 2 days since they'd moved Angela from the trailer to this place, and the tension inside the cabin had grown tighter with each hour. Deke paced less now and watched more, arms crossed, eyes following shadows as if waiting for something only he could sense. Cole hadn't checked in the night before. Deke speculated he was out checking the ridge trail or scouting the old perimeter, but no one had seen him since dusk. Angela had heard him pacing once, briefly, earlier that morning, but his absence since then cast a longer shadow than usual. Outside, one of the guards stepped out for a smoke, letting the screen door creak open behind him. He moved casually to the porch's edge, struck a match against the rail, and lit a cigarette with a long drag. The ember flared red in the dark, a tiny lighthouse in the black expanse of forest. He didn't hear the movement behind him, not the careful step over gravel, not the soft thud of boots pressing into damp soil. There was no sound to alert him when a gloved hand reached around his face and clamped over his mouth, dragging him backward in a single practiced motion. He dropped the cigarette, the ember spiraling into the leaves below. The matchbook hit the porch with a soft tap. His eyes bulged. A brief struggle, a strangled noise swallowed into the night. And then, nothing. Only the wind answered. Inside, Kevin sat by the wall, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the door as if expecting it to fly open at any moment. He had the rifle now. Deke had insisted someone keep it nearby in case their guest's husband showed up unannounced. Kevin hated holding it. The weight of it, the oily feel of the barrel, the tension in the spring-loaded trigger. All of it reminded him how wildly unprepared he was for anything beyond running his mouth. He had heard something, a whisper of motion outside the back window. A bird, maybe, or the trees shifting, or another sound. This one sharper. A faint rustle to the right, too close to be harmless. Kevin jerked upright, heart kicking in his chest like it wanted out. "Did you hear that?" he called. Deke didn't answer right away. He was still seated near the main room, half watching the door, half reading over a map laid out on the coffee table. His voice came low and cold. "You think yelling is going to help? I heard something in the trees. It's the wind." Kevin took a step toward the window, eyes narrowed. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it with his sleeve and squinted into the black. Nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling crawling up his spine. "I'm going to check it," he muttered, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "You step out that door and fire a shot," Deke warned, "and you'll let half the county know we're up here." But Kevin was already panicking. Another sound now, louder, a snap, like a branch giving underfoot. Kevin spun and pointed the rifle through the crack in the door frame, his fingers white-knuckled around the grip. "Hey, who's out there?" he shouted, voice cracking. Then he fired. The gunshot split the quiet like a whip, echoing through the trees, raw and misdirected. A wild burst, a warning without a target. Angela flinched from the blast, her ears ringing from the close range of the report. The wall between her and the hallway throbbed with vibrations. She leaned toward it, blinking away the momentary haze. "Kevin," she said softly, just loud enough to be heard through the plaster and wood. There was silence, then a footstep. He had stopped moving. "Kevin," she said again, slower this time, her voice pitched low, almost soothing. He hesitated. "What?" "You're not ready for this," she said. "You're not like them." There was another pause. The weight of it filled the hallway. "I didn't want to take you," he muttered. "That wasn't my idea." "I know," she replied. "But you're in it now, and he's coming. You feel that, don't you? Kevin said nothing. He'll hurt you, Angela continued, not with malice, but with truth. Not because he's angry, because it's what he's trained to do. Because you were there when I was taken. Because you're in the way. Her words weren't shouted. They slipped through the cracks like fog, curling around the edges of Kevin's panic. Outside, Deke cursed under his breath and strode to the generator closet, cursing the sound of the wasted bullet. His hand reached for the radio he'd tucked into his belt. He keyed the mic, intending to call the guard outside. Static answered him. He keyed it again. Come in. Nothing. He looked toward the front door, eyes narrowing. The porch was too quiet. The guard was gone. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The cabin sank into total darkness. The only sound now was the faint click of Kevin rechambering the rifle, his breath sharp and fast. And beyond the walls, in the forest that pressed up close on every side, something began to move. The darkness had weight now. Not just the absence of light, but the slow realization among those inside the cabin that the dark wasn't empty. It was watching, breathing, moving. Kendricks circled the rear of the structure without sound, crouched beneath the natural slope of the hill, his breath steady, every muscle tuned to precision. The trees overhead rustled faintly in the breeze, their branches cloaking the scene with long-fingered shadows. Ahead, the cabin's rear entrance stood in partial silhouette, lit faintly by the moon through the thinning cloud cover. A lone figure emerged from the shadows of the cabin's side, walking the back path that looped around the woodline. He moved cautiously, one hand resting on his belt, a flashlight in the other, its beam slicing a narrow arc through the darkness. He had just turned his back to scan the tree line when Kendrick struck. He surged upward from the brush with the silence of a panther and caught the man from behind, one arm wrapping tightly around his neck, the other seizing his wrist to silence the flashlight. The man struggled, kicking backward with a grunt, trying to claw at Kendricks's forearm. But the grip was airtight, trained, honed over years of infiltration. He didn't let the guard drop immediately. He lowered him slowly, pressing the man's weight into the soil until the last of his resistance ebbed away. Kendricks exhaled once and quickly dragged the body beneath the porch lattice, covering it with a camouflaged tarp he had stashed hours earlier. No blood, no noise, no witnesses. From there, he turned toward the northeast edge of the cabin, where the slope dipped into a shallow hollow. Just beyond the second ridge lay a narrow tunnel, carved years ago into the earth for drainage, originally installed by forest rangers to reroute seasonal runoff beneath the building. Kendricks had helped construct it during one of his last recon training cycles in the area. He remembered it well. Now, it would serve a different purpose. He crawled in low, keeping his chest close to the ground, pulling himself forward through the narrow shaft. The air inside was damp and stale, the walls slick with old moss and earth, but the tunnel held. After 12 meters, it angled upward toward a crawl space just beneath the cabin's foundation. Kendricks paused at the rise, adjusted the optic lens mounted to his headgear, and surveyed the underside of the building. From below, he could hear every footstep above, every creak of movement, every hiss of breath in the floorboards. He was beneath them now, but first he needed their attention elsewhere. Retreating back out through the tunnel, Kendricks rose from the hollow and sprinted in a low crouch through the trees until he reached the supply cache he had planted earlier in the evening, a small, fire-ready cluster of pine brush soaked in accelerant and rigged with a timed flare. He checked the wind. Southbound. Perfect. He struck the ignition and stepped away as the flare hissed to life, casting a sudden orange pulse through the trees. Within moments, flames licked upward from the underbrush, feeding on the dry fuel and kicking smoke into the sky. It wouldn't burn long, but it would burn fast, and visible from the cabin windows, It would draw every eye away from where he truly needed to be. Inside, Angela had heard the gunshot from earlier, then the abrupt blackout. Since then, nothing had felt right. Kevin's footsteps had been erratic. Deke hadn't barked a command in nearly 10 minutes, and no one had passed the hallway in longer. She felt it again. That charge in the air, that tight pull in her chest, like gravity had shifted sideways. It was a feeling that once meant incoming fire. Now it meant Kendricks was close. She sat upright slowly, then twisted her torso and groaned, clutching her side like she'd been stabbed. She let the sound echo down the hall. "Help!" she croaked, pitching her voice just above a whisper. I think I'm bleeding." The silence beyond the door held for 3 seconds. Then footfalls. Heavy, urgent, unsteady. Not Kevin, not Deke. The rhythm was familiar. Cole. He opened the door too fast. Angela didn't flinch. She hunched forward, keeping her breathing shallow and her face pale beneath the thin light bleeding in through the slit above. Cole stepped into the room, muttering, "Don't start now. We don't need more drama." He never saw Kendricks. The moment he cleared the threshold, a figure rose from behind the inner wall. Silent, dark, precise. Kendricks's forearm shot around Cole's neck, pulling him backward into the shadows of the room. Cole grunted, flailed, reached for his sidearm, but Kendricks slammed him against the wall and drove his knee upward into Cole's abdomen, once, twice, 3 times. Bone cracked beneath the pressure. Cole buckled, but didn't fall. He twisted free and swung with a wild haymaker, catching Kendricks in the shoulder. But the strike did nothing. Kendricks stepped in and delivered a brutal elbow across Cole's temple, forcing him against the opposite wall. The 2 men crashed against the radiator, and Angela flinched as it rattled beside her. Cole reached desperately for his knife, but Kendricks was already driving his palm upward beneath the chin, stunning him. Then came the finishing blow. A swift downward hook to the base of the neck, followed by a precise thrust to the diaphragm that sent Cole slumping to the floor. Kendricks drew the suppressed sidearm from his belt and brought it up, not to fire, but to remind Cole who held control. "Stay down," he muttered. Voice low, voice cold. Cole didn't move again. Angela stared at him, chained and bloodied but alive, her mouth parting slightly in disbelief. She'd known he was coming, but even she had not anticipated the quiet devastation Kendricks brought with him. He moved to her next, his face lit briefly by the emergency light flashing from the hallway. "Took you long enough," she whispered. Kendricks knelt and smiled faintly. Had to make sure they knew it. Then he began unlocking her cuffs. The chain hit the floor with a metallic rattle that seemed louder than any gunshot. Angela rubbed her wrists, the torn skin still raw but already burning with renewed purpose. Kendricks helped her to her feet with one hand, while the other remained close to his weapon, eyes never fully leaving the hallway. "We're not out yet," he said softly. "I know," Angela replied, her voice steady. "But we're not trapped anymore either." They moved quickly and quietly. Kendricks led them toward the kitchen, where he knew the floor plan offered a view of both exits. Cole's body remained crumpled in the back room, unconscious and bleeding, his weapon already secured. The cabin creaked faintly beneath their feet as they crept past the narrow stairwell, the distant sound of wind knocking a loose shutter somewhere outside. But Deke wasn't outside. Not yet. He had heard the commotion, felt the shift in the air, and moved before he even thought it through. He had seen the back door hanging ajar, seen the empty guard post. Then the light died, and the hallway had gone quiet. Too quiet. From the other side of the main room, Deke crept toward the side corridor, the pistol in his hand already drawn. His jaw was locked tight, breath shallow, pulse pounding hard enough to blur his vision. He didn't need confirmation. He already knew. He's here. Deke rounded the corner just in time to see them, Angela moving toward the front exit with Kendricks behind her. She turned slightly, glancing over her shoulder, and that moment of hesitation gave Deke what he needed. He lunged. Angela was faster than he expected, twisting just as his arm closed around her, but he managed to lock her against his chest, with the pistol angled toward her ribs. Her heel connected with his shin, hard enough to stagger him, but he dragged her backward with brute strength, retreating toward the rear exit as she kicked and shoved and twisted. Kendricks froze in place, gun halfway raised. Deke's pistol was pressed just below Angela's shoulder blade. "Put it down!" Deke barked, voice shaking. "Put it down now, or I swear I'll drop her where she stands." Angela struggled again, elbowing his side. Deke's grip tightened. Kendricks didn't flinch. "You won't do it," he said evenly. "Try me," Deke snapped. "I'll end her life and leave you with nothing." Kendricks's stance didn't shift, but his voice cooled. "Then you've already lost." Deke began pulling Angela toward the back of the cabin, keeping his weapon aimed at her spine while scanning the room for movement. His sweat was visible now, glistening along his temples, his composure fracturing with every step. Angela's body moved stiffly, resisting without panicking, timing her moment. She wasn't breathing through fear anymore. She was counting, watching. As they reached the open back door, Deke twisted slightly, adjusting his hold. Angela felt the motion, sensed the brief looseness in his grip, and acted without hesitation. She rammed her elbow into the soft spot between his ribs and twisted away in one fluid motion, throwing her body sideways out of his line of fire. Deke staggered backward with a grunt, firing a shot that buried itself into the cabin wall behind her. Kendricks didn't wait. He fired 2 rounds in rapid succession, measured bursts that traveled clean and low. One struck Deke in the thigh, just above the knee, sending him crashing to the floor with a roar of pain. The second clipped the edge of Deke's pistol, knocking it from his hand and skidding it across the wooden floor. Angela hit the ground and rolled behind the overturned couch. Her hand reached instinctively toward the floor. And there it was. Cole's sidearm, dropped earlier and left forgotten in the chaos. Her fingers curled around the grip just as Kendricks moved across the room to close the distance. Deke was crawling now, hand outstretched, blood spreading beneath him in a slow, ugly bloom. His other hand reached blindly for the pistol as Kendricks approached. "You think you're the only one who can take something back?" Deke rasped, still reaching. "You think this land makes you special? It doesn't. It was never yours. You were just holding it till someone with power came to take it." Kendricks stepped forward, kicked the gun out of Deke's reach, and leveled his own directly between the man's eyes. "No," he said, his voice like stone. "You didn't come for the land. You came to take something you didn't earn. That's what men like you always do." Deke's face twisted with hate and fear, his mouth shaping another insult, but Angela was already rising behind the couch, the pistol in her hand steady as a steel beam. "I've got him," she said calmly, her eyes never leaving Deke's face. "Finish the sweep." Kendricks nodded once. "If anyone else is left inside, they'll be here in seconds." He turned to clear the next room, moving swiftly but cautiously. Angela stood over Deke now, her weapon aimed with precision, watching the man bleed beneath her with no hint of pity in her gaze. "You thought we were alone," she said quietly. "You thought we'd fold, but you made one mistake." Deke winced, sweat beading on his forehead. "You underestimated what we protect when we say, 'This is ours.'" Deke lay half upright against the floorboards, one hand pressed against the deep wound in his thigh, his breath wheezing in through clenched teeth. Sweat beaded across his forehead, glistening beneath the dim, flickering emergency light. He stared up at the pistol in Angela's hands, her arms steady, her aim fixed, the weight of everything she had endured now focused through that single trigger finger. Behind her, Kendricks stepped into view, emerging from the hall with the silence of a storm that had already made landfall. His weapon remained lowered, but every line in his body said he didn't need it raised to finish what had started. He moved with the same calm control he'd carried since the night began. Slow, precise, composed. Angela gave a nod without shifting her posture, never taking her eyes off Deke. Deke glanced between them, swallowing hard. His voice cracked as he spoke, hoarse from shouting, from pain, from the realization that his plan had not only failed, it had collapsed under its own weight. "Look," he began, breath-catching. "You made your point. All right? I see what this is now. You two, you're not soft. You don't scare easy. I didn't expect that." Kendricks didn't respond. He took a step forward, then another, until the floor creaked faintly under his boots. The sound was steady and slow, like a clock ticking down. "I never wanted it to go like this," Deke continued, pushing his words out through gritted teeth. "Nobody needed to get hurt. I just wanted the land. That's it. And I didn't come up with this play on my own. There are people above me, bigger names, lawyers, developers. I'm just a middleman." Still no response. Kendricks kept moving, closing the distance one controlled step at a time. "This was never about you," Deke said, raising his hands slightly, though the pain in his leg made the movement uneven. "You weren't supposed to be part of this. We figured you'd leave it alone. Take the payout. Sell the land. And walk." Angela's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The silence hung heavier now. Deke tried again. "I didn't know who you were. No one said anything about your background. If I'd known, if anyone had known, things would have gone different." "That's the second time you've said that," Kendricks said finally, his voice quiet, but with the weight of iron behind it. "And it won't matter a third." He stopped just short of Deke's side, towering over the bleeding man without raising his weapon. There was no theatrics in his presence, just a cold gravity, like something in the earth itself had shifted in his favor. "You came to my home," Kendricks continued, his voice low and deliberate, each word landing with the force of a measured blow. "You stood on my soil and smiled while you made threats. You tried to take what didn't belong to you, and when that didn't work, you took my wife." Deke flinched, but said nothing. "You want me to believe this was just about the land?" Kendricks asked, voice tightening. "You think a few signatures and a title search make this justified? You think calling it business makes it clean?" Deke hesitated, then offered a broken smile, desperate and laced with something close to defeat. "Come on. You can't win this thing long term. Even if you get out now, those people I mentioned, they don't stop. You really think you can hold on to that land when they start pushing again? Paper trails don't go away just because you want them to." Kendricks's expression didn't change. "You never had a deed," he said. "You had intimidation. You thought the right amount of fear would get the job done. But you were never close. We never signed. We never agreed. All you ever had was a threat." Deke tried to sit up straighter, but pain ripped through his side and forced him back down. "I still know things, names, people who won't want this getting out. You want leverage? I've got it." Kendricks crouched beside him now, calm as ever. "That's not the kind of leverage I deal in." In one clean motion, Kendricks flipped Deke onto his stomach and pulled his arms behind his back. Deke shouted in protest, but Kendricks was already binding his wrists and ankles with zipcord from his pack. The man twisted and groaned, but Kendricks didn't rush. Every knot was tight, every movement exact. Angela stepped forward, finally lowering her weapon slightly, though her eyes remained locked on Deke's face. "What now?" she asked quietly. "We just leave him here?" Kendrick stood and adjusted his gear. We leave him for the ones who should have stopped this before it began. He'll be found. Deke struggled again. You're making a mistake. You think this ends here? You think people like you can just disappear into the hills and the rest of the world won't come knocking again? Kendrick stepped over him, set a burner phone beside the bound man, and keyed in a single message already drafted and queued for transmission. It was addressed to the sheriff's personal line. Coordinates, names, evidence. They'll come, Kendrick said. But not for me. Angela moved beside him, her breathing calmer now. You sure we leave him breathing? Kendricks glanced down at Deke, then back at her. I don't want blood, he said. I want quiet, and I want peace. If we start writing new rules, we become what he is. Deke's expression twisted into something between a sneer and a grimace, but he didn't speak again. He lay where they left him, bound, broken, and no longer in control. Kendricks turned to Angela, the hard lines in his face softening only when he looked at her. She nodded, and they walked together out into the dim gray light of dawn breaking across the ridge, the world slowly returning to color. Behind them, the cabin sagged under its own secrets, and silence returned to the woods like a curtain falling on the final act. The forest still held the breath of what had happened. The wind had picked up just after sunrise, and with it came the smell of smoke curling through the trees. Not the scent of destruction, but something deliberate, something clean. The kind of fire meant not to rage, but to consume with precision. Kendricks and Angela stood together at the edge of the clearing, watching as a controlled blaze flickered through the clearing behind the cabin. They had found the weapons cache beneath the back floorboards, military-grade rifles, extended magazines, armor-piercing rounds, and enough ammunition to outfit a private militia. Deke and his men had clearly prepared for more than intimidation. They had planned for siege, for resistance, for domination. But now, each crate burned in the fire pit Kendricks had dug by hand, the flames licking along the polished black steel as it twisted, cracked, and finally collapsed under its own heat. Beside the fire lay a stack of smoldering electronics. Burner phones smashed open, memory cards split and dissolved in chemical solvent, laptops stripped of hard drives and left to warp in the blaze. Kendricks had made sure to purge everything. He'd wiped every digital trail, rerouted every traceable signal, scrubbed the metadata from communications and tracker logs. If someone ever came looking, they would find only ashes and silence. Angela watched the last of the flames rise and let her shoulders fall slightly, the tension in her spine beginning to loosen at last. It had taken hours. But everything that could be used against them, every recording, every fingerprint, every scrap of data, was now gone. She turned to Kendricks, her voice low, almost too tired to echo. Do you think it's enough? Kendricks's eyes stayed fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. It has to be. They returned to the cabin not to rest, but to finish what had to be done. The inside still smelled of tension, sweat, gunpowder, damp wood and adrenaline, but it was quiet now, and the light from the broken windows stretched long shadows across the floors. Kendricks moved through the rooms with practiced diligence, wiping down every surface they had touched, using alcohol and a cloth to scrub prints from doorknobs, tables, railings, and even the undersides of chairs. Angela followed behind, double-checking the work, gathering anything that had been left behind. A discarded bandage, a cloth from the radiator, her own boot print near the fireplace. They worked together without words. Every motion spoke for them. This must end clean. They weren't going to leave ghosts behind. In the front room, Angela paused beside the couch. The cushion still bore the faint impression of her knees from the night before, when she'd crouched with a pistol trained on the man who nearly destroyed their lives. She pressed her palm flat against the fabric, as if willing the memory to dissolve into the grain. Behind her, Kendricks folded the last of the blankets, placed them back in the linen chest, and swept the floor with a soft, wide-bristled brush. By the time they were done, the cabin looked untouched. It looked forgettable. Kendricks left one final item before they locked the door. On the table where the weapons had once been stacked, he placed a sealed envelope. Inside it, a typed document detailing names, dates, coordinates, and the full extent of what Deke and his men had planned. Every detail that mattered. Every truth the sheriff would need to bury the case without lifting a finger. There would be no trial, no headlines, just quiet arrests and closed files. Once the cabin was locked, Kendricks and Angela returned to the truck. The tarp was still in place, the tires clean, the plates replaced once again with the original tags from 2 days before. Kendricks checked the engine, then opened the passenger door without a word. Angela climbed in, folded her hands in her lap, and watched as the trees receded behind them in the side mirror. The drive was long and wordless, the silence between them not heavy, but whole. It was the kind of silence built between people who had crossed something together and come out the other side still side by side. They didn't need to speak. Everything had already been said in motion, in action, in the decisions made when it mattered. Outside the windows, the trees gradually gave way to open road. The dark canopy thinned into morning haze, and the first colors of dawn pressed gently against the horizon, bleeding rose gold into the fading mist. As they turned off the highway and back onto the familiar dirt road that led to the farm, Angela leaned her head against the window. The gravel beneath the tires shifted in a sound she hadn't realized she missed, the soft, honest rhythm of home. The farmhouse came into view, unchanged and waiting, its windows catching the early light, its porch steps just as they had left them. Nothing had been touched, and yet everything felt different. Kendricks parked near the barn and stepped out. Angela followed, slower now, her knees still sore, her movements careful but calm. They walked together without a word, up the steps of the porch, and sat down side by side on the bench beneath the windows. The sky above them was pale and soft, the sun just beginning to stretch its arms over the horizon, lighting the fields in slow gold. The rows of vegetables stood in quiet order, the morning dew clinging to their leaves like small offerings. Birds stirred in the trees, but the land remained still, as if recognizing the return of something it had been holding its breath for. Angela reached over and slid her hand into Kendricks's. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His fingers closed around hers with quiet certainty. And they sat like that, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing, letting the silence do what words could never finish. The county sheriff's office smelled like coffee and floor wax, but that morning it also carried something sharper, an undercurrent of urgency masked behind forced routine. The sheriff sat behind his cluttered desk, the phone still warm from a call that had ended moments earlier. His face held no emotion as he reached for a pen, but the notepad beside him already bore a single line written in block letters. Anonymous, tip, Bodine Ridge, cabin, East Trail. He tapped the pen twice, then set it down and stood. By noon, the place would be crawling with deputies, and by sunset, every local paper in 3 counties would be sniffing for a scandal. 2 days after Kendricks and Angela returned home, a pair of hikers stumbled onto the edge of the burned clearing near the cabin. What they saw prompted a call to emergency services, which escalated quickly to state jurisdiction. By the time the sheriff reached the scene, the damage had already been cordoned off with yellow tape and the perimeter marked forensic style with numbered flags. The wreckage was unmistakable. The fire had done its job. Charred crates of illegal arms, the twisted remnants of scorched vehicles, and a patch of blood-soaked earth where something violent had happened. No official records placed the cabin on any lease or owned land. No permits. No names. Just the ghosts of something that didn't belong. 2 bodies were found, both badly burned, unrecognizable without dental records. Another was confirmed dead behind the cabin, partially covered by a tarp. A 4th body was never recovered, but blood trails suggested someone had either escaped or been taken. It didn't take long before the sheriff found himself seated across from Kendricks and Angela Vale at their kitchen table. The house smelled faintly of breakfast, coffee, oats, something baked, and both Kendricks and Angela were calm, composed, and prepared. Kendricks wore the same farmer's clothes he'd been seen in for years, hands rough from honest labor, his demeanor unbothered by the visit. Angela sat beside him, her shoulders relaxed but alert, every word measured. The sheriff didn't waste time with theatrics. He laid out the facts, one at a time. Tips, fires, illegal weapons, burned bodies. The sheriff had known Kendricks for years in passing, enough to recognize the man's stoicism wasn't an act. Still, this was different. "You two haven't noticed anything strange these past few days?" the sheriff asked, his tone casual but laced with quiet scrutiny. Angela glanced toward Kendricks, then shook her head. "Just a few calls from buyers. People still asking about the land," Kendricks added without looking up. "Had someone in a dark truck parked out by the east fence 3 nights ago. Didn't stop, just watched. I shined a light, and they drove off." The sheriff nodded slowly, trying to read between the lines, but there was nothing there. No flinch, no tremble, not even a pause long enough to suggest invention. "We've had some chatter," he said, leaning back. "Word is, someone's been moving military-grade equipment through these parts. Whole operation vanished into smoke. Thing is, there's no paper trail, no fingerprints, no one registered at that cabin, no one local filing noise complaints, just a lot of speculation." Angela folded her hands in her lap. "You're thinking this came from around here?" "Not sure what to think," the sheriff admitted, "but I figured I'd ask the folks with the most land between here and Bodine Ridge." Kendricks held his gaze for a long moment, then asked, "You find anyone alive?" The sheriff studied him. "One, a kid. Looks shaken. No ID, no weapons. Won't talk. Scared out of his mind. Seems more afraid of what comes after than what just happened." Neither Kendricks nor Angela reacted. The sheriff let the silence stretch a little longer before he stood. "Well, if you hear anything," he said, reaching for his hat, "you know where to find me." Angela walked him to the porch, thanked him for stopping by. Kendricks didn't follow. He stayed inside, placing 2 mugs of coffee on the table, one for each of them, hands as steady as if nothing had happened. When Angela returned, she sat beside him without speaking. They listened to the sheriff's car pull away, the gravel crunching beneath his tires fading into the distance. Across the county, Kevin Motley sat alone in a holding cell, his face pale, his knuckles raw from gripping the edge of the steel bench too tightly. The deputies had offered him coffee, water, even a cigarette. He said nothing. He just stared at the floor, his mind replaying that final night in the woods over and over. Cole disappearing, Deke dragged into the dark, Angela whispering through the wall like a voice from the dead. They asked him who was involved. He shook his head. They asked him what the cabin was used for. He looked down. They asked why his name showed up on a burner phone left at the scene. He closed his eyes and stayed that way. Kevin wasn't stupid. He knew what would happen if he talked. But more than that, he knew what had happened to the ones who thought force could buy ownership. He had seen what came out of the dark. And he had heard what happened when men underestimated the quiet ones. So he said nothing. Back at the farm, the day unfolded in silence. Kendricks returned to the fields that afternoon. working his way through rows of sprouting vegetables. Angela stayed near the house, repairing part of the fence where the storm had taken down a panel earlier that week. There was a peace in the simplicity, not because they had forgotten what happened, but because they had survived it. They didn't speak of the sheriff's visit. They didn't ask what Kevin might say. There was nothing left to guess. What needed doing had been done, and what needed silence had been buried deep in the soil, where it would stay. The days passed without ceremony. Rain came and went. Tools returned to their usual places. Life resumed its quiet rhythm, though beneath it all lay an undercurrent of something heavier, unspoken but understood. The world beyond their fields hadn't yet caught up to what had unraveled in the woods, but it would. Far from the farm, somewhere between the trees and the smoke, justice began to crawl out from the shadows, not in the shape of sirens or headlines, but in the slow, steady revelation of consequences that couldn't be buried forever. They found him slumped against a tree at the edge of the ridge, barely conscious, his thigh wrapped in a tourniquet crafted from his own torn belt. Blood had seeped through the makeshift bandage, dark and drying, and ants had already begun to trace the outline of the wound like nature itself had started the slow work of reclaiming him. Deke's hands were zip-tied behind the trunk, his arms pulled tight, chest rising in shallow, ragged breaths. Around him, the morning light cut through the trees in long, golden shafts, painting his disheveled figure in an almost biblical stillness. But this was not a man waiting for salvation. The deputy who found him followed the trail of ashes back to the cabin. When the state authorities arrived, they uncovered more than wreckage. Beneath a panel near the collapsed rear wall, they discovered a sealed canvas bag, fireproof and marked with fingerprints that didn't belong to any law-abiding citizens. Inside were pages of damning evidence. Scanned memos between contractors, emails from a real estate firm detailing how local pressure points were to be applied, photos of bribe envelopes, copies of draft deeds naming Deke as a power of attorney over land that was never his, false signatures, misdated affidavits, even a map with pins spread across the county, plots marked for acquisition, including several belonging to families with histories just as deep as the Vales. The story never made the front page, but it made its way to the inboxes of the right people. And suddenly, the developers who had backed the move began pulling out. Quietly. Contracts were voided. Offices were shut down. Some claimed market volatility. Others cited project restructuring. But none of them came back. And Deke, once full of menace and ambition, was escorted into custody by two men in plain clothes, placed in a cruiser without resistance. He had nothing left to trade, nothing left to threaten with. Whatever empire he thought he'd build had burned to the ground, and all he had now were scars and silence. Back at the farm, Kendricks stood under the afternoon sun, hammer in hand, squinting against the light as he refit a section of the north fence. The boards had warped after a summer rain, and though the job was small, he approached it with quiet care, measuring twice, placing each nail deliberately, the way he had done with everything in his life that mattered. The kind of work that left your muscles sore, but your mind clear. Angela crossed the yard with a tall glass of lemonade in one hand, a towel slung over her shoulder. Her walk had changed, not in how she carried herself, but in how she carried the past. It no longer weighed her down. It had become part of her spine. She handed him the glass, her fingers brushing his, and he drank deeply before setting it down on the post. For a moment, they watched the fields stretch into the horizon. The rows of crops had come back strong, the sunflowers reaching high, the tomatoes weighing heavy on their vines. Bees hummed among the lavender rows, and a hawk circled far overhead, its wings catching the light like burnished bronze. Angela looked at Kendricks, her voice soft, but laced with the realism they both lived by. "What if they come again?" she asked. Kendricks didn't look away from the fence. He lifted the hammer, tapped one last nail into place, then finally turned toward her, meeting her eyes. "Then we bury them deeper." She didn't flinch at the answer, didn't ask him to soften it. She only nodded and picked up the empty glass, and together they walked back toward the house as the wind began to lift through the trees again. Later that week, Kendricks opened the sealed footlocker beneath the floorboards in the pantry. He stood over it for a long time, the air still, the house quiet. Then, slowly, he reached in and began removing the contents. One by one, each item was wrapped in canvas, labeled, and placed in a new box, locked, sealed, and buried beneath the barn under 3 feet of earth. No intention of digging it up again. No plan to keep the fire burning forever. He didn't need those tools anymore. His war was done. Angela's work took a different path. Word had spread about what had happened. Not in detail, not with names, but in essence. Stories of intimidation, stories of resistance, and with those stories came questions, and with questions came courage. She applied for and received a teaching grant to help preserve the region's agricultural heritage. She started a community program for land literacy, helping families protect what was theirs, teaching neighbors how to read deeds, track filings, and recognize legal tricks for what they were. Others began to follow her lead. A town that once held its tongue started asking louder questions. The next time a developer sent scouts, they didn't get far. They were met with cold stares and full parking lots at public hearings. One man even found a chicken coop moved into his driveway with a sign that read, "Not welcome." And still, the Vales farm remained untouched. One afternoon, just before dusk, Sheriff Harlan pulled up the gravel drive in his old Crown Vic. He parked under the shade of the large oak and stepped out, hat in hand. The sun hung low behind him, draping the land in amber light that made everything seem as if it were glowing from the inside. Kendricks met him near the porch. Angela was inside, finishing paperwork for her grant. The sheriff didn't say much at first. He looked out at the rows of green, at the shed where new tools were stacked in careful lines, at the front door that stood open, as if the house itself had nothing to hide. Finally, he nodded toward the fields and said, "Hell of a place you got." Kendricks nodded once, firm and clear. "Not for sale." They shook hands without another word. The sheriff got back in his car and drove off slow, like a man who knew he'd done all he could and left the rest to the right hands. And in the stillness that followed, Kendricks turned toward the house where Angela now stood watching from the doorway, a soft smile on her face and the scent of basil drifting through the screen. The land was quiet, but it was alive. And this time, it would stay that way. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.